Part two of our lecture on the rise of Russia begins this time of trouble. So Ivan IV, who ruled from 1533 to 1584, is Ivan the Great's grandson. So he also had a nickname. He was Ivan the Dread or Ivan the Terrible, based on the translation. He was fairly violent and not very predictable. He had at least one wife, one of eight, that died under suspicious circumstances. And he wound up killing his own son. He got in an argument with his son and clubbed him in the head with a scepter, and his son died. And he was fairly traumatized by that. He reshaped the Russian government and made it based more on merit, which we've seen in other places. And he also, there are a couple of things in here that are familiar if you've studied the rise of Nazi Germany, and that he confiscated large estates from the boyars, right, our landed nobility, and then gave that wealth, the land, to people who supported him. And the Germans will do the same thing, taking property like houses and wealth from minority groups like Jewish people and giving it to people who supported the Nazis, which swelled their ranks. He also had a reign of terror, and we have the Oprichny, which dressed in all black, rode black horses. They were the Republican Guard, the secret police of Russia, and they did not make a special appearance in Elf, though those guys did look a little bit like them. And they used terror to keep the population in check. They only had to report to Ivan IV, so they didn't have to worry too much about what the society thought of them. They only had to answer to him, so that worked out fairly well for them. All right, so next you'll see, after Ivan's death in 1598, that when he died, there was no one to take his place. So we have about 15 years of just complete chaos. We have peasant revolts, we have invasions from Poland and Sweden in 1610, and that continues until the Romanov dynasty is established with Mikhail Romanov. So he is chosen as the new Tsar in 1613. He is the son of a Russian patriarch, so he's definitely from upper class of society, and the dynasty will last until the Russian Revolution in 1917. He limits the powers of the nobles and of the church, and he establishes Russia's autocratic monarchy. The famine and death that occurred before his reign is diminished, and so when Peter the Great becomes the Tsar in 1682, he's got this desire to improve Russia, and he does that by moving it closer to the West. You'll remember when we started the lecture, I told you that Russia was more European before the Mongol control, and then after the Mongol control, it was seen as more Oriental. So Peter I, also Peter the Great, tries to move Russia to embrace more of the West. So he does that with the technology. He invites Western dignitaries to establish quarters in Moscow. He tries to modernize Russia from the top down. He incorporates the science and technology of the West. He sends Russians out into Europe, to France and Spain and England, in order to study how their governments function, in order to study their military structure, their command control and training programs, and also how the industrial complex is woven into the fabric of society. How do heavy industries, which Russia didn't have a whole lot of, how do they perform and how are they managed? And so he sends these essentially cultural spies out. They were invited, and it wasn't like they were undercover, but they were definitely there to gain the information and see how things were practiced in Western culture. I already said that these are definitely autocratic. He wanted to build a powerful modern army in Russia, and he knew he couldn't do it in isolation. He had to radically change all of Russia in order to make that military reform. Some of the things that he did was that he increased the pay for people who are in the military. He increased the fire capacity for weapons and improved the quality of the weapons for the army in Russia. He required that the officers be educated. They studied complex math and geometry and languages, and he built the largest European army to date by doing that. He eventually came around in 1700s, the beginning part of the 1700s, where it's able to defeat Sweden, which is a good show of success in comparison to how they were being invaded prior to the Romanov rule. So he is considered a progressive, but he's definitely autocratic. He is not asking the people of Russia, is this what you want? He sees it as being the best thing for them. It's also coincidentally the best thing for him, and he is making these decisions. Not all of them were popular, though a lot of them were right. So we've got this bureaucratic reform in order to make tax collection more efficient. Only educated nobles could be government officials. He's got social mobility for civil servants based on their merit. If you are a good postal worker, then you get to move up the ranks of the postal service. And so he incorporates that into his government across the board. He also creates social reform. Prior to Peter the Great, society was definitely divided by sexes. So men hung out with men and women hung out with women, and they didn't mix publicly. And Peter the Great changes that. He pushes them to mix the sexes socially because that's what was going on in Western Europe. And he wanted them to be more westernized. He also required the people of Russia to wear Western clothing. So they had been wearing traditional Russian dress for all of their history. And he comes along and says, now you're going to dress this way. And oh, by the way, men, you have to shave your beards or you pay a tax. He fined them if they kept their traditional Russian beards. And so that was pretty remarkable and very autocratic. It would be difficult to imagine that happening in the United States if they tried to dictate whether or not you could or could not wear a beard. He creates St. Petersburg, which he obviously names after himself, as a window on the West. He establishes it as a new capital. He puts it on the Baltic Sea so that it's a port and a trade site, and it is the headquarters of the Russian Navy. A couple images here for you to see of Peter the Great. Statue and map, and then of course an indication about the naval center at St. Petersburg. All right, so a couple more slides here. Mostly what I'm looking at is about this shift to westernization. He wanted to imitate and copy them, and he did that by sacrificing the traditional culture of Russia, and that was not accepted. That was not they weren't excited about doing that. They wanted to stay to their traditional ways. So not everybody supported him, though as an autocratic ruler, everybody did what he said, or most everybody did what he said. He began with the military and the social technology, and then shifted that, and then that grew out into the social, economic, political, and intellectual change. He wanted to westernize it, and in doing so, he modernized it. So it's kind of a horse and cart analogy. He modernized their institutions. He wanted to try to avoid losing the heritage, but he sacrificed it where necessary. And they borrowed a lot of the technology. But the westernization part was his goal. Modernization was the means to do that. A couple of questions about his process. I've said it a couple of times already that it was definitely top-down. He wanted to make Russia militarily strong. And that was his goal. He didn't care about making things better for the peasants or for the average person. He wanted Russia to be able to kick butt on the battlefield. And the only way he could guarantee that was by enforcing all these other changes. Um, he required that the nobles be educated and cultured, including in how they behaved. And he creates this model of how to become more westernized, which we've seen other countries follow suit. Japan and Saudi Arabia have followed in some of these same steps. And so we have traditional elements that oppose that westernization, but once they are dependent on the technology, they have problems that come about that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So that is kind of worth noting. And also, I just want to reemphasize the fact that his goal was to westernize, not modernize. So he is followed on the heels by 4 czarinas. A czarina is not a term I've used before. If the czar is the autocratic monarch, then the czarina is the queen version of that. Russia doesn't have a rule limiting or prohibiting female rulers, just like they don't have a law that prohibits female soldiers. So they are definitely unique in that as far as Western civilization is concerned. We have Catherine II, who married Peter the Great's grandson. He was a horrible czar. She had him imprisoned and then murdered to get him out of the way. And she negotiated with the boyars that if they would support her, she would let them keep their serfs, which they definitely wanted to do. She continued his policy, Peter's policy, of westernization. She liked the ideas of the Enlightenment, but only for the nobles. And she kept out anything that she felt would weaken her rule. So she was not completely bought into the Enlightenment. She only wanted to pick and choose the parts that would make her rule as Tsarina stronger. And this last slide here. So there's a rebellion, in 1773. So this is around the time of the American Revolution. We have Cossacks, which I mentioned earlier, about being kind of on the on the border of Russia. And they protested taxes, so they rebel. Pugachev decides to name himself Peter III, so he wants to be the next czar. And he slaughters, in the rebellion, they slaughter thousands of nobles and government officials and priests, so it's all-out war on Russia. And in turn, Russia turns around and crushes him in 1774. So that does not last. But the effect of that is that Catherine decides to eliminate all reforms. Having seen the impact of the rebellion and what she hears about the French Revolution, she decides that reform is not worth it. So she reverses the policy of westernization and goes shielded up. She starts to buffer between foreign influence and Russia. Thus endeth the lecture. So if you would like to go back and play this again, if you missed anything in the fill in the blank notes, you can do that. I also want you to study the first and second part of your notes. There are 2 more parts of your notes, but it would behoove you to study these before you come to class next class period.